Hello, I'd like to welcome you back from your coffee break. Lovely. And I'd like to welcome you back for our continuation into session 2 for our conference Leadership in Tomorrow's World. I'm also a Foundation Future Leader, one of the cohort of 2022. So it's nice to see some of the other members within the cohort. And I think we all agree we've been very privileged to be part of this program over the last year and are sad to see it almost end at the end of this year, but I'm sure we're going to keep all those connections and be involved in all these spaces of discussions moving forward. So in this session 2, we're going to have 2 speakers, and then we're like in the first session, we'll have the Q&A at the end, and then we'll be joined by 2 further panel members who also are part of this Foundation Future Leader program. And this session is on net zero meeting the challenge. So net zero resolving the climate emergency is a global challenge in which everyone must play their part. And winning this contest will provide structures and approaches for other challenges like biodiversity and long-term sustainability. Our first speaker is Professor Gideon Henderson, who is Chief Scientific Advisor in DEFRA. He is a Professor of Earth Sciences at the Department of Earth Sciences in the University of Oxford. And in 2013, he was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society. So I'd like you now all to join me in welcoming Gideon to the box here. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Great pleasure to be here. And these 2 talks, I'm going to focus mine largely on the UK and perhaps rather more on carbon. And I think Brian, who follows me, will give a more of a global perspective. I hope they'll complement each other well. And on my opening slide here, as well as introducing the concept that I'm thinking particularly about the UK here, you see an image that shows the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere as it moves around in atmospheric circulation. And we know, of course, that a big amount of the CO2 that's there, which is driving climate change, is coming from power stations such as this one. For those of you who may live in the Oxfordshire region, which I do, you might recognise this as Didcot Power Station, although this is a photo from about 10 years ago. And Didcot Power Station at that time was responsible for burning about 3.7 million tonnes of coal every year. That's a lot of coal. It's quite a difficult number to actually visualize or think about, isn't it? 3.7 million tons of something. Coal's got a density of about 1, so if you can actually visualize it this way, you can think of it as about a running track, a 100-meter track. So get that into your head, and then times a running track the other way, so square, and it's about 370 meters, so roughly 4 running tracks up, a pillar of coal that big every year being burned by this power station and put into the atmosphere. Okay, and this was one of about 8,000 power stations that were burning coal at that time and putting all that carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So it's pretty striking. In some ways, it's pretty arrogant of the human race to think we could carry on doing that and changing the atmosphere so substantially and not expect to see a change. But of course, we had expected to see a change. We knew that CO2 in the atmosphere would lead to global warming. We'd known that since Arrhenius, a paper in 1896, first indicating it would happen. And the experiment that he suggested we are now running on the Earth, and others have confirmed we're running on the Earth, is a successful experiment. CO2 causes warming. We've tried it on Earth and it happens. And here it is. This is a figure that I'm sure very many of you have seen before. This is a figure I've actually taken the last year, so October to September. So you can see 2022 on this figure as well. And you can see how we're heading for probably the 5th warmest year on record this year. And we've had 8 of the the 8 warmest years ever in the last 10 years. So significant warming has happened. So the UK, of course, has recognised this challenge. And I think it's important to think of the UK as quite a leader in recognising this challenge, the need to decarbonise and to control climate change. And we were really pioneers with the Climate Change Act in 2008, which stated the legal intention of the UK to reduce our carbon emissions to 20% of 1990 levels by 2050. And since that time, we've really been quite successful in doing so. And this figure summarizes it. It's one of a number of figures that I borrowed from the Committee for Climate Change, which was also established in 2008 by this Act. You can see the different sectors and how we've managed to reduce since 1990 to a relatively recent year. And I'll point to some of the successes first of all. So we've managed to decarbonize, sorry, I'm looking at the wrong one, waste here, which is the light blue here, and power in particular is two that we've really stripped a lot of the CO2 emissions from. So what we've done to realize that are things like this. This is Didcot. This is coming back to the same power station that I started with. And as you can see, it's no longer there. At least the coal-fired aspect of it has gone. Let's look at that one more time. I love that movie. It's really cool. Just, there's no soundtrack, but you can hear all sorts of people gasping and screaming. What I love about it is this tower, as it goes over, this one, sort of crumples up like a bit of cloth. It feels like it's just something soft and destroyable. Look at that. Anyway, I'm getting distracted. So that's the end of coal from Didcot. That's the 3.7 million tonnes a year of coal gone from that power station. And we replaced it, of course, in the UK. Oops, that seems to be, I like it, but I don't like it that much. Okay, now we've replaced it, of course, with renewable sources of energy. And this is a picture taken from an aeroplane. I know I probably shouldn't have been flying, but taken from an aeroplane at the sea below, the wind turbines that we have used to replace our electricity supply. So the UK has been a bit of a global leader and has made a good progress, but not enough progress. And I think globally, this was really recognized at the time of the Paris Agreement in 2015, where it was acknowledged that we didn't need to just reduce our carbon emissions, we needed them to get them to zero or net zero in the second half of this century, and ideally by 2050 to control climate. And at one point or another, every country in the world has now signed up to the goals of the Paris Agreement. There is really no more debate about the fact that climate change is real and we need to do something about it and we need to get to net zero. Again, the UK can claim some sort of leadership in this area. We were the first major economy to sign into law the requirement to reach net zero. And this is Chris Skidmore, then a Bayes minister, doing that in 2019, just a few years after that Paris Agreement. And we were the beginning of quite a large number of other countries that have followed. And this nice online tracker shows you in dark green the countries that have got a legal requirement to get to net zero, those which have got a specific policy objective in light green, and others that are moving that way in brown on here. So the whole world is really moving towards this goal of getting the carbon budgets, the carbon balance into net zero. Now that, of course, increases the challenge very significantly. I'll talk you through this graph in just a minute, but if you think back to the earlier one with the colors on it, the things we have decarbonized, like electricity and waste, relatively easy things to decarbonize. We're now getting to the things that are really challenging to decarbonize in our society in the UK, but actually globally as well. So in this UK example here, we've got emissions per year against year, and the black is where we've already gone here. So it reflects the change you saw already. On here now, you see carbon budgets. These are part of the legal requirement that the UK must step down our emissions in 5-year chunks out to the future. And you can see that the black line might have got us out to 20%, but it needs to steepen significantly if we're going to get to net zero. So we need to decarbonize the hard to decarbonize sectors more quickly than we've been going up to now. And just before the COP that we hosted last year, the UK committed to a 78% reduction relative to 1990 by 2035, by carbon budget 6. So within spitting distance, that's the same as 80%. That means we're trying to do what we were trying to do by 2050, now 15 years earlier at 2035. That's really a substantial challenge if we're going to meet that goal. Now, the UK has made plans to try to do that, and these were again published before COP. This is the net zero strategy. Although it's come in for some criticism, I think it is true to say that it's the first similar document anywhere in the world of a nation really laying out its plan for how it would try to get to net zero emissions. It was accompanied, as a scientist I should mention this, it was accompanied at the same time by a publication less well known, laying out the research and innovation that the UK would need in order to get to meet that challenge and get our emissions down to zero by 2050. There's lots of interesting things in the net zero strategy, the UK strategy. This is one that I'll use as an illustration of how we might try and do it. And this is an indicative pathway of how the UK might try and reduce its emissions forwards to that carbon budget 6 and 2035, 37. I'll talk a bit more about some of these stripes in just a minute. You can see all of the different sectors plotted on here. I would just draw your attention though on this graph, as I'll come back to it a couple of times, to the blue that's below the line here, this idea that we don't just need to reduce the sectors that are emitting, but we also need to do some things to withdraw CO2 from the atmosphere if we're going to get a line for our carbon emissions that tracks down with time at sufficiently rapid rate. So I think it's worth saying just a little bit about how this is managed inside government. So I'm a chief scientific advisor. One of the things that I do inside government is work out how we're going to actually meet some of these goals. And of course, the net zero challenge is spread across multiple government departments, with almost every department having some sort of role. So I hope you can read this. It says at the top, just to go through it, so BEIS are responsible for climate mitigation. They have the overall responsibility at government level. They split up that goal between the different departments. They assign a portion or an effort share to different departments. And they don't just do that based on a uniform, everyone's got to make 78% cut. They do it based on an assessment of how difficult different sectors are to decarbonise. And they're largely informed in that area by the Committee for Climate Change. So a reminder here that overall what we're trying to do is meet a 78% reduction by Carbon Budget 6. Now I'm going to dive slightly more into my own department as an example of how this challenge gets difficult when you go and look at one particular department. So I'm going to start, and for the rest of the talk really, focus in on DEFRA. The 4 sectors that we are responsible for are shown here: agriculture, land use, waste and F-gases, for fluorinated gases like CFCs. And you can see the emissions of carbon that come from each one of those. And our effort share was about 1/3 of that total. So we don't have to do the 78% cut. We've got to do about 1/3 of that cut, which is quite challenging enough. And the fact that we've got to do that cut smaller than some other departments is because our sectors are often very difficult to decarbonise. And that's why we need to do more research and innovation to solve it. So let's dive into those. I mentioned that there are 4 sectors here: agriculture, land use, waste and F-gases. I'm just going to focus on the first 2 of those given time constraints, and they're the 2 perhaps the biggest and most challenging. So agriculture on the left here, land emissions, so land use change on the right here. You can see that the left-hand figure shows you the total UK emissions. So you see roughly how much agriculture is relative to all of our emissions. It's quite big, and it's getting proportionally bigger because everyone else is decarbonising quite effectively. And then you can see in the colours here, you probably can't read the key, but the purple and the red on here are various things to do with cows. So it's cows belching and it's cows manure releasing nitrous oxide. So those are big sectors of our emissions, is to do with meat production. On the right-hand side, you see again that the 0 is across here. So you can see land use has the potential to be negative. So growing trees in green here is removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and that's why there's negative. And then above the line here in orange is peat. And peat, the very rich soil that you often use in horticulture, is, we've got a lot of it in the UK, it's busy breaking down and releasing its CO2 to the atmosphere. And that's a relatively new part of our budget, only been added in international metrics recently, but is causing a big headache in the UK to our emissions levels. So there's some of the, this gives you an idea of some of the sectors we need to think about, particularly cows, peat and trees on here. So overall, just to focus on how difficult this is for a minute, this is a graph, the same colour scheme, same report from the Committee for Climate Change, showing you how we have struggled to reduce emissions from the agricultural sector. So the purple and red of cows here, really rather stable through time. Unlike other areas like electricity and waste that I showed you at the beginning, these are sectors that are not dramatically reducing agriculture and land use. So for the rest of my time here, I want to quickly run through what are in DEFRA's area 4 of the biggest patches that we need to worry about if we're going to meet the challenge of net zero. So trees, biomass, peat and cows on here. So tree planting we know is good. It sucks carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. It increases biodiversity. Everyone loves it. But there is a real challenge with tree planting, and there's just not enough room to put the trees. And you can do that from an academic point of view, just like look at how much land is available and see how much you could plant. But you also need to think about it in a cultural and societal way. Land, especially in the UK, is owned by people who have rights to that land and might not want to put trees on it, might not want to mortgage their land or might have other things they want to do with it. So meeting the goal of 30,000 hectares of new trees every year, which is what the Committee for Climate Change suggests the UK should do and what UK government policy states we should be doing by the end of this Parliament, is actually very challenging. And you can see we haven't met 30,000, which is up here, in any year for the last couple of decades, and we're struggling to ramp it up again. So although this is a bit of a no-brainer, let's have more trees, it's challenging to do it, and we're trying, it's one of the big areas of difficulty to ramp up. I should mention that trees are not just for woodlands. A real great thing about trees, you make forestry products. Forestry itself is good. It's good to cut trees down if you do things like this with them and you put them embedded into buildings where they are stored carbon, they've displaced cement, which makes CO2, and they give you room to grow more trees again. So cutting down trees can be a good thing to do. Next, I'll mention biomass quickly. This is a great app. If people haven't got the Grid Carbon app, I really recommend it. You can always look at it and see exactly where the electricity is coming from in the UK at any one time. This is a screen grab from a while ago, but it's fairly indicative of the typical sorts of numbers that you get in the UK. And what's often surprised people who haven't stopped to think about it is that biomass is really high on our list of energy sources. We burn a lot of wood in this country, mostly imported, but we could also grow a lot more wood in the UK. We could grow biomass to burn and generate energy and therefore displace fossil fuels. And we might even do something called BECCS, which is a technology which globally climate scientists and negotiators have lent on quite heavily as a way of doing negative emissions, so a way of drawing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And in BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, you take your biomass, you burn it, you capture the CO2 and you put it underground. So not only do you make energy, but you also suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. It's controversial, but it's almost definitely got a place to play in balancing our carbon budgets in the UK and internationally. And if we're going to do that, we need to grow more biomass, again, using up land area to grow non-food crops this time, but to move them into the energy sector. The third of those big areas I'll mention is peatland. I said that this is relatively recently taken into our accounting. You can see where there is peat in the UK. It's emitting extremely large amounts of carbon because as you dry it up, it starts to rot and turn into CO2. And some of that CO2, in fact, the highest fluxes are coming from areas that are some of our most rich agricultural land. Another set of real challenges about how we can maintain food supply and growth of food while reducing the emissions that we have from our peatlands, which are currently a big component of UK emissions. And what I've talked about so far, don't worry about this map so much, I'll give you an idiot version of it in a minute. What I've talked about so far is we need more trees, we need more biomass, and we need to get off our peatlands. All of those need space. The UK is not over-endowed with space. And if you look at the sums to get to a balanced budget, we need about 2 million hectares of the 24 million hectares that the UK has in total. We need to move that into some form of carbon beneficial activity. So this is a complicated map. I told you I wouldn't pick it apart, and I'm definitely not expecting you to look at the key on here. It's relatively easily findable online, but I quite like the version that was produced for the Dimbleby report recently, which was looking at UK food system and food strategy. And this divided it in a very schematic way into the way that we use our land. So it's the same data, but now arranged in cartoon format. And it's really revealing, this image. It shows, for instance, that, where's the one I like? So we've got roughly the same amount of land for Christmas trees as we've got for orchards up here. Isn't that amazing? As many Christmas trees as apples. It's quite, if you look at this, you kind of pick apart all sorts of interesting things about the way that we use our land in the UK. And one of the points that I think Henry Dimbleby was trying to make with this, and it jumps out on the figure, is that we use a hell of a lot of it in green here for production of meat and dairy. So this is an area, and actually for pasturing meat and dairy in particular. And that's a reason why, from the Committee for Climate Change point of view, and for many climate activists' point of view, focusing in on meat and dairy is seen as one of the things we should do in the agricultural system. But it's not easy. It's not easy from a government point of view or from a public perception point of view. Many people really like their dairy, really like their meat. It's difficult to move public opinion as a whole. And farming societies, communities, rural communities are built around systems that have been in place for many generations that are reliant on moving a system which is based around meat production away from that is an extremely challenging thing to do, but it's something which clearly needs to be part of the thinking and the mix as we think about how to reach net zero. So I've given you a fairly rapid gallivant there through some of the areas that DEFRA sees as particularly important because they're very big chunks of emission in our sectors and areas where we think that we need to make some changes. These sorts of activities are laid out in the net zero strategy that I showed you on a previous slide here, published last year. This is a clip on the screen now from the key policies section of the chapter that really deals with DEFRA's sectors. And you can see some of the things that I've mentioned here laid out as explicit government policies, like the tree planting ambition on this slide. I also, although my red square has slipped slightly here, I do want to highlight to this scientific audience and as a scientist that part of what we are doing in DEFRA is to spend, we're committed to spend 75 million in this spending review period, specifically on the research and innovation that is going to be required to work out how to solve what is really a very challenging problem for DEFRA sectors if we're going to decarbonise. So I focused in on DEFRA. Let me just close with a couple of slides to bring the picture back out again and think more widely in the UK. This image here shows you the DEFRA sectors at the top. So I've been focusing in particularly on the two green ones. LULUCF, by the way, is land use change and forestry. So that's the land use bit. So I've been focusing on the two green bits on here and how challenging those are to reduce. But if you look further down this bar chart to an area that you might be working in or thinking about or an area that you care about, I think you'll readily recognise that there are very substantial challenges in decarbonising in all of these areas and lots to do across government and across the science and engineering environment. But it does matter. And I want to show this slide as the final slide. It's sometimes a bit of a surprising slide to show at the end. I can't quite work out where we are. I guess we're somewhere over here, are we? Somewhere here in Borough. And this figure shows you quite vividly why we need to care about this. This is the Thames Barrier up, stopping London from flooding. You see how vulnerable London is already. Climate change is causing sea level rise. We are going to have to build a new Thames Barrier at some point in the future. If we don't stop climate change before it gets too acute, London becomes undefendable and we can't protect the city that we're all enjoying living in, working in and being in at the moment. And that's just one way of bringing home the need to work out how to decarbonise in DEFRA sectors, in the UK sectors, and to carry on leading the world so that we can see the whole world decarbonise in the future. So thanks very much for listening.
Thank you so much for that really interesting presentation, Gideon. So now I'm going to hand over to the second speaker, Professor Sir Brian Hoskins, who's chair of the Grantham Institute at Imperial College. He's also been a member of the 2007 IPCC Climate Change Assessment, for which a Nobel Prize was awarded. His research interest has been in weather and climate, in particular understanding and model of the motion of the atmosphere on all scales. And in 1998, he received a CBE and was knighted in 2007 for services to the environment. So if you can join me now and please welcome Brian. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you, Gideon, for that lead off. If I can just be a little bit more critical of the UK than perhaps Gideon is able to be. I was on the Climate Change Committee for its first 10 years, 2008 to 18. And we were always raising, yes, we're doing well now, but are we going to meet the future targets? And over the years, the Climate Change Committee started using ever more strong language to try and say we need a step change and whatever, because we do see some areas, in particular power sector, where there's been tremendous advance. However, we see other sectors like transport, where despite electric vehicles, the emissions are almost flat, and buildings leak like sieves, and there is no, the government policies to change that have been to say the least. They've been off and on. And so we are critical of the way the things are going. It's been great what we've done, but we're no longer leading the world as we were, and it needs political power to make us get back there. So that's my sort of slight carp beyond what Gideon is allowed to say. So I thought I would start with a global CO2 chart. Gideon and I discussed that perhaps it would have been best the other way around, but I think in some ways it's good. You've seen Didcot Power Station. This is what happens when you integrate up all those emissions of carbon dioxide around the world. And this is the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's actually measured in Hawaii, but those motions of the atmosphere stir it up such that it really doesn't matter where you measure it in the world. You get approximately the same measurement, certainly over a few years' time scale. And this is actually from last month on the right-hand side, back to 1957 on the left-hand side. And if you can see the numbers, it was back something 315 back then. The pre-industrial value is probably about 280, and we're now up to above 420. So from pre-industrial times, it's risen 50%. And there are so many strands that says that's due to our activities, impact in burning fossil fuels in particular. So there is no doubt that this is due to us. About half of what we've emitted is left there in the atmosphere. And while ever we go on emitting carbon dioxide, it will go on rising. Now, carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases are great news. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here because this planet would be frozen. So that 280 level was very important. However, like a lot of good things, when you have too much of them, then it's not such good news. And it is inevitable that as CO2 goes up, the planet will warm. There's no discussion on that. The only discussion is on how much. So if we're going to stop climate change, the only way to do that is to make the net emissions of carbon dioxide a zero, and that's the net zero. Now, because it goes on accumulating, it isn't just CO2. Usually what you see is a mixture of all the greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide is the dominant one, but methane is important, nitrous oxide, and other gases as well. And those other ones make up about 20% to add on to the CO2 effect. The metrics you all see like a CO2 equivalent, but actually they all act in a different way. And when we get near net zero, we may have to take that into account. So that's the picture we have, and carbon dioxide has been rising. I might note here, I gave my first public talk on climate change in 1975. And you can see that over the years, I've been pretty ineffective about persuading anyone that this is a real problem. If we look on this, then the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change produced its first report in 1990. And the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the countries of the world getting together to discuss how to limit this, met for the first time in 1995, but still the CO2 goes on rising. So Gideon has showed you a picture of the temperatures, global temperatures. I'll show another one, which is over the years I've shown the picture like Gideon, but it's amazing that the impact that Ed Harrison's had with his climate stripes, where it's the same picture, but you have a blue color for a cold year and a red color for a warm year. And it's even on the Reading Football Club shirts now. I mean, this is everywhere. It shows the impact of actually communicating something in a manner that actually people can take on board. And this is another way of viewing that with temperatures, global temperatures, which can be put together, reconstructed for the last 2,000 years. And there you see this latest post-industrial period on the right-hand side. And one has to say it looks rather unusual. Even Lord Lawson might say that, and the Global Warming Policy Foundation, although I've heard them say it's probably not. So that's what we're dealing with there. the problem, and that's the observed. It's unprecedented, essentially, what we're doing. Now, along with that, with the changes in global temperature, before I actually discuss this one, then we've seen many things change around the world in terms of climate. The temperature extremes have made huge impact in many countries around the world, including the UK, records so here, there, and everywhere. So the extremes in temperature, and they've had huge impact as well on deaths, but on making a greater toll on human life. And then there's been the changes in rainfall. So it's been the average rainfall changing, but most important, it's actually the way that rain comes down. For perfectly good reasons, we understand a warmer atmosphere can hold more water. If it's 6 degrees warmer, it can hold 50% more water. So it's a very large effect. So the same rainstorm would be 50% larger in a 6-degree warmer world. And we are seeing that almost around the world, the heavy rainstorms, even in places where the total rainfall has decreased. When it comes down harder. And that's much more difficult to deal with in terms of flooding and in terms of actually collecting water for human use. So we need to look at this and project for the future about what might happen. And this uses various models, climate models, developed from weather forecast models by adding on more modules. But there's Newton's laws underneath that in terms, and the thermodynamic equations, and then representations of various things that one has to put in. So these are model produced, but in order to project for the future, you need to say, well, what are we going to do? How much will we emit of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere? And here you see a projection of temperature rise into the future. And the top ones are as if there is no change in behavior. And the bottom ones are if global emissions fall rapidly to zero, certainly by the middle of the century. And you can see the temperature change by the end of the century, depends on what we do. At the upper end, it's 4.5 degrees. At the lower end, it might be 1.5 degrees. So it depends on us what happens there. Now, I want to show one picture to get into detail on this, because globally average temperature is really just a metric of how far we've got along the trail of changing the climate. We don't feel the globally average temperature. So this is what the model suggests the temperature will be as a function of latitude, longitude, for a 4-degree temperature rise. And almost everywhere over the continents, it's more than 4 degrees because the ocean takes a lot more to heat it up. So it might be 5 degrees over the tropical continents. That's way beyond the natural variability, which is very small in the tropics. So that's a huge impact. And then in the higher latitudes, you can see numbers like 7. In the wintertime, it's more like 12. We're talking about 12 degrees warmer in the regions of permafrost. So you can imagine what that would mean. And another feature just to note from this, the temperature contrast between one region and another would be different. And that means the weather would be different. It's not just the same climate warmer with the same weather. Weather feeds off temperature contrasts. The weather would be different. Right-hand side shows precipitation. That's the mean, with some areas like the Mediterranean so much drier there that the agriculture of today may be almost impossible. Other areas wetter, but again, throughout the regions, then the rainfall is heavier when it comes down. Gideon mentioned sea level. I decided I would show a picture of sea level projections. And down the bottom there, you can see the range from the lowest scenario to the highest scenario, maybe 0.5 to 1 meter by the end of the century. And that's a very significant sea level rise. It's been about 20 centimeters so far. And the impact of the hurricane that hit New York, for instance, was a lot greater because the surge was on top of a 20 centimeter sea level rise. And so the overtopping was that much greater. So the present 20 centimeter is important. And if you live in an island in the Indian Ocean, then it's already getting pretty dangerous. So we're seeing a range there from maybe half to 1 meter. But the top line there is something that the IPCC tended not to do before. I think if the climate scientists could be criticized, it's because they tended to give what we get if we're lucky, the very smooth change, the lowest common denominator of all those discussing it. The top line is actually what we cannot rule out on our understanding of the physics of the climate system. So it says that the low likelihood, but high impact, certainly high impact, because that's saying that sea level could be 2 meters higher by the end of the century if we go on the upper scenario. And Gideon showed the Thames Barrier. The plans for the next Thames Barrier are such that one could cope with a 2 meter sea level rise, and that's why. Now, the bad thing about sea level, in particular as climate change, is its timescale is many centuries, principally because the ice takes a long time to really melt, and also the ocean, the bottom of the ocean doesn't know it's warmed yet, and the ocean expands as time goes on. So by 2300 on the low scenario, 0.5 meter to 3 meter, and on the upper scenario, best estimate of 2 to 7 meters, but we can't rule out 15 meters or greater. We're talking about something here, if you think about the cities of the world, which are mainly built on the estuaries near sea level. This is just something that I don't know that we'll be able to cope with. We won't be able to do the Dutch thing of building those around the world to protect everyone. So that's the pretty stark thing of sea level rise. You may hear of tipping points, and as a mathematician, I would prefer sort of that we reach thresholds of change in behavior, perhaps. But what we're talking about is a possibility of jumps or rapid changes in the Earth system. This could be due to a sudden reduction in the Antarctic West Antarctic ice sheet. We don't really understand how that ice sheet is able to lose its mass on the edges. It's happened 125,000 years ago that it lost a lot of its ice, and that could happen. It's being undermined. A lot of it is not grounded on land and can be undermined by warm water around there. So there could be a large reduction in the West Antarctic ice sheet. The overturning of Atlantic circulation is maybe something that would be switched off. As the tundra melts, is there going to be a large release of methane? Well, these things could happen, and many others. We don't know where those threshold points are, but we do know as the temperature rises, the likelihood of them becomes much greater. I think sea level, human tipping points are also very important. In fact, some of them may be more important. This rising sea level, at some point, along with the temperature rise, somewhere like Bangladesh, for instance, becomes almost unlivable. And already the saline waters are getting into the water supply there. And is India going to say, welcome to the millions of Bangladeshis, come in, cross here? We've seen the pandemonium in Europe with a few thousands wanting to migrate. We're talking about huge numbers here, rising sea level. Too hot to work. The human body cannot stand a certain wet bulb temperature greater than 35 degrees. The body cannot cool. And certainly at the higher levels of emissions, by the end of the century, there's many parts of the tropics that will be greater than that temperature for some months in the summer. That means the human body just can't. So people will not be able to do anything, basically. It's all right to say, okay, go into air conditioning, but that's not going to be a solution. The staple crops failing, at some point, if those crops fail, there's going to be a threshold with migration or societal unrest, repeated droughts or floods again. So I think what we're seeing is something here that probably won't kill the human species, but it may be enough to make us kill each other. So that's the nasty thing there. What can we adapt to all this? So I think, I've said already, the devastation caused by the climate events that we've seen shows that we haven't adapted to even today's climate, let alone the changing climate. It's a problem in developed and developing countries. It's not just the developing countries. We're not prepared. We keep building in floodland floodplains. I mean, this is just not on. So we're not adapting, but in the developing countries, it really can be crippling. And depending on emissions, in some places, adaptation could be practically impossible. I've already said that in many cases. I did want to put this into the wider context of a growing world population, move to cities, changing diet, changing the wrong way, unfortunately, taking on the Western diet rather than moving the other way, and the increasing demand for food, water, and energy. And I also want to mention the biodiversity crisis, for which there are international discussions at the same time. Of course, a lot of this is in the Sustainable Development Goals. You see them there, you see them on my badge here. I hope you're very aware of those UN Sustainable Development Goals agreed in 2015, but the progress has not been great. Now, climate change is number 13 there on the bottom left, but many of the things there are very strongly linked to climate change or influenced by it. For instance, if I take the third from the left and the top row, that's human health. Well, certainly in academic circles and health in the UK now, and perhaps worldwide, climate change is viewed as the biggest danger for human health. So we see a big link there. You can't have human health in the absence of dealing with climate change. And if we see some of the others, the yellow one on the left is renewable energy. If you go across these, I think 80% of them are very involved in the climate change issue. But equally, in handling climate change, we should not do anything that makes those problems more difficult. And for instance, the biodiversity crisis, we should be handling biodiversity crisis and climate change at the same time. I wanted to mention a little bit about the international negotiations. I've mentioned the UNFCCC to start with. This is where the countries of the world get together. And they've been doing it since 1995. And the 21st one of those was in Paris. And that's where the agreement was that the temperature rise should be limited to less than 2 degrees and an ambition of not more than 1.5. The big change in Paris and the success was to move to not telling countries what they should do, but actually asking them to volunteer what they will do. And so these nationally determined contributions were given in Paris for the first time. And the very important thing, they're going to be reassessed every 5 years. That was delayed, but that's where Glasgow came in there. And the rules for doing all this were a bit confusing, but that was Paris. And then Glasgow. It didn't achieve as much as we might have hoped, but it did do better than some of us feared. And I think the tests will all the words spoken really be backed up by global greenhouse gas emissions actually peaking and starting to go down. We've still seen them going up, and they need to peak by the middle of the decade and start falling rapidly by 2030. Are we going to see that? And the other thing is the financial. The rich countries have promised the developing world, the poorer countries, that we'll put a fund of 100 billion a year to help them cope with climate change. That was done many years ago. It's still not there. And the question as it comes to the next one in Egypt, are the rich countries really going to stump up with this money? Now, the COP27 is going to start on Sunday. And the background to that is not very hopeful, I'm afraid, because of the international situation and the lack of much revision of the NDCs. There are some hopeful signs. Let me I'll give one in a moment. I wanted to give just a little bit about the IPCC as well. This is the scientists getting together, scientists and those academics, policymakers, etc., wanting to actually assess the situation and input to the governments. So they input to the UNFCCC negotiations. So the latest reports were in 2021. Working Group 1 is the scientists. They reported first, came up with words like, unless there are immediate, rapid and large-scale reductions in emissions, limiting warming to 1.5 will be beyond reach. And I think really everyone's beginning to realize it is beyond reach now. Working Group 2 in February, they're the ones who look at impacts. And they said the scientific evidence is unequivocal. It's a threat to human well-being and the health of the planet. Any further delay in concerted global action will miss a brief and rapidly closing window to secure a livable future. Working Group 3, that's the policy one. The evidence is clear. The time for action is now. We can halve emissions by 2030. It's now or never. So I'm afraid that sounds a bit stark, all that. And but I like to be positive. We can do it. We know how to do it. The question is, do we have the will to do it? Now, one recent report came out a few weeks ago. The International Energy Agency looked forward in the power sector CO2 emissions, and it starts in 1990, and you see it going up, but you see the total, they think it's probably just about peaked, and the emissions from the power sector around the world are liable to come down. If you look into that, you see the advanced economies, it's liable to come down quite well. And the question is about the emerging and developing economies. And they will need the help to develop in the new way of doing it. So they need to leapfrog the way we've done it for the new technologies, and they need our help to do that. Then this is almost the last picture I'm going to show. It may look a little confusing. This again was actually from last week, I think. This is the United Nations Environment Programme, and before each COP, they produce an emissions gap report. They say, this is where we are, this is where we want to be. So they're looking at various greenhouse gas emissions scenario. Does this pointer work? No, probably not. So I'll have to guide you through this. So the scale is in gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year. You've got 60, the mark at the top, and 20 is the mark at the bottom. And you can see where we are today, roughly. And in 2010, we were going up in that gray line with those policies. With the current policies, we're in the area of the blue, where current policy scenario, which is just about level with a bit up. If you take the NDCs that the countries have committed to in Glasgow and with a few modifications, then we're in roughly that orange, red zone, perhaps going down a little, but really not much. Whereas if we want the emissions to be consistent with the 2-degree range, you see the blue there, and through to the 1.5-degree range, at the bottom there, that's where we need to be. And up the top is where we are. So this is called the gap report because they say those bars there show the gap between what countries of the world are promising at the moment and where they should be if you want 2 degrees, or where they should be if you want 1.5. And the 2 degrees needs about a 1/3 reduction, and probably a quarter reduction actually, and the 1.5 degrees needs at least a quarter or more. So a third or more. The gap is just huge. My last slide will then come back to mentioning what Gideon has talked about as well, where we think about the total picture. And this is a schematic that has been around for some time, but this is the Overshoot Commission, where they're thinking about, well, the rate we're going to overshoot what is a comfortable temperature for the world and for the world's population. And the green curve there, this is some sort of measure of time, shows you what greenhouse gas emission reductions might be possible in some time. And by the end of the period, they're almost, the reductions might be down to a certain level there, such the change on the axis here, we have potential warming and its impacts. So the greenhouse gas emission reductions nearly to zero. So the warming and impacts are almost stabilizing there, except sea level, of course. So to make them stabilize, we need a bit of atmospheric CO2 removal, and the sort of things Gideon's talked about there are important, that and how we deal with the land surface and with the vegetation. Well, at the moment, we're on the left-hand side of this picture with some adaptation and some experienced impacts. But as we go to the right, then the greenhouse gas emission reductions, maybe the world will manage to stabilize the temperature somewhere near to 2.8 degrees or something. And that almost definitely will not be a comfortable temperature for us, the sea level will go on rising. So it's possible that we will decide that we need to remove a lot more CO2 from the land surface and from technology, actually removing CO2 from the atmosphere. Beyond that, we need adaptation, and depending on how we do this, the impacts may even reduce. But that's an idea of how that may go in the future. We're headed for an overshoot of what we want. We need to act now, because if we can't manage 1.8, 1.9 is much better than 2, 2 is much better than 2.1, and so on. Whatever we can do, we need to get there. Then we may decide we have to go down to a lower level of CO2 in the atmosphere. Thank you.
I'd like to invite Gideon up as well, and want to introduce you as well to some other members of the panel. Thank you so much as well, Brian. That was absolutely fantastic presentation there. I'd like to now introduce you to the Dr. Lizzie Moyse, who is also on the Foundation Future programme with me. She's a hydrogeologist by background with previous experience working in the nuclear industry, and she currently works for Arup, a global sustainability development consultancy, as their research development manager for the UK, India, Middle East and Africa. And then also I'd like to introduce you to Mark Jacob, a zoologist by background, and he leads a multidisciplinary team of scientists in DEFRA's Environment Science and Analysis Division in producing the outcome indicator framework for government's 25-year environment plan. So welcome to you both, and I would like maybe to give you an opportunity, if you'd like to expand a little bit on maybe my introduction, or if there's any comments on your topic or what you've heard so far. Lizzie, would you like to?
Yeah, so I think just coming from a bit of an industry perspective, apologies, like Alex, I keep all my notes on my phone, but just a few thoughts on what I think was particularly relevant from this morning's session for net zero, and a few comments on Gideon and Brian's talks. I think interdisciplinarity, as we mentioned earlier, is really key to meeting the challenge in this area, and going forward, I think we're going to have to sort of step up on doing that interdisciplinarity. As it was mentioned earlier, I think industry are quite good in that area in many ways for delivering work, and both delivering research in industry. It's very routine for us to work in that interdisciplinary way, and I think there are fewer boundaries potentially maybe from academia. I also wanted to reflect a bit on the timescales that have been discussed today. The 10-year time horizon keeps coming up quite often, and a reflection from industry is where we are, it can take 6 months to procure and sign off contracts to even do anything. I think 10 years could be gone in the blink of an eye. I think given looking back at what can be achieved in 10 years, it's potentially exciting and interesting to see what changes can be made, but I just remain a bit skeptical about some of the horizons. So looking at the knowledge and skills horizon, I think it's fantastic that we get that pipeline in place. I think some of the things around baccalaureates that were discussed, very, very exciting for that interdisciplinary way of working. But I also think we need to be looking at transferable skills and upskilling people who are out there already in the new technologies and new areas we're going to have to be working in to deliver net zero. Also on the long-term view of interventions that are being made now, I think as Daniel was talking about in his question earlier, it's key that what we're doing now is almost future-proofed for what we want to be doing in the future and where we want to get to. So, for example, some of the things my organisation does, we're in those buildings area that both Gideon and Brian flagged as a difficult area to decarbonise. And some of the things we're doing are retrofitting current buildings, designing for deconstruction, building in circular economy principles so that we can reuse materials that are already out there, make better use of what we have, are going to be key. But we need to be taking that long-term view, because those things that we're building and putting in place now are going to be still there and operating at least in 2050. Hopefully, and that is so we're building the future of where we want to go already. I also had a reflection just on, we've talked a lot about the need for increased investment in R&D. but it was mentioned earlier that there are some systemic challenges to what we're doing. And I think from an industry perspective, a few of those are, rather than the sort of quantum of investment around things like the TRL levels and how do we broach that valley of death in things that are coming out of research and then getting through the implementation phases. And I also think maybe there's something more around that translation and transfer around the exchanges between industry, academia and policy, and how do we get that knowledge exchange really going and everybody working together to go forward. I also think, as was highlighted with the SDGs, that net zero can't be addressed in isolation, and all the other challenges that we're facing should be taken into account while we're meeting the challenge. Social health and equitable transition all need to be considered. I think being based in the north, so my power station I think of is Drax. And as you mentioned, the biomass needs there, and whether we're offshoring some of the problems that we have at the moment, and we need to get better at taking account of the whole systems approach to what we're doing is really key. And I think we also, as mentioned, need to really focus on getting net zero to where we need to be, but while we're doing that, creating resilience and adapting to what's coming.
Thank you, Lizzie. And Mark,
Yeah,
I invite
sure.
you to.
Thanks very much for inviting me to join the panel. Maybe I might start by just slightly unpacking the perhaps somewhat nebulous description of what my job is, because I'm aware outside the civil service, sometimes these words are a bit hard to discern. So I lead a small team in producing government's outcome indicator framework for the 25-year environment plan. For anyone not familiar, the 25-year environment plan is in essence a commitment to improve the environment, the state of it within a generation. So the outcome indicator framework was a commitment as part of this to develop an evidence base that allows progress towards that aim to be understood. So the outcome indicator framework is a publicly visible evidence framework of 66 indicators which aim to describe at a very high strategic level how the environment in England is changing. So we do that through different thematic chapters which are aimed to be accessible to the average person. We want to kind of cut through any overuse of jargon. So you'll find it linked under things like clean air, water, thriving plants and wildlife, etc. So all of that's available. Have a Google to your heart's content and engage with the evidence. We'd really enjoy that. But my role in producing that is, well, firstly, it's a tremendously enjoyable one. It's honestly daily impressive the amount of expertise and passion that exists in the diverse scientific fields that provide the data we draw upon. But there was two charts from the presentations today that I think highlighted two really nice points of the role of my team's work and the importance of our perspective that we provide on this. So I think Gideon's highlighting of the importance of land use decisions in considering net zero is a really important one because it frames this challenge in the wider landscape, and I mean that in both the figurative and the literal sense of that word. We need to support ecosystem services, food security, human needs. Cultural ones are not irrelevant in that consideration because ultimately we do want to have a society in which we live and don't just persist in a bunker. So I think it's really important to approach net zero from a mindset that doesn't seek to solve one existential crisis and then perhaps inadvertently create another one or others. So it would be a really wasted opportunity to pursue net zero without an appreciation of the wider environment. So I think that's a really good reminder of net zero's place there. And I think another one, another chart that jumped out at me from Brian's presentation was effectively showing and reminding that climate change isn't this theoretical ghost of Christmas yet to come. Even if we were to stop emissions now, climate change has happened and will continue to happen in the immediate future. So climate change adaptation is of key importance in that regard because we need to improve the resilience of already stressed habitats, species and settlements. But I also, on the basis of work that I engage with day to day and seeing that diverse picture of different elements, things improving, things decrease, perhaps being on a less impressive or optimistic trajectory, does give me an in the round view that I would completely agree with Brian's point of optimism to find, to view this challenge from we can do it, we must do it. I think science, innovation and the role of the public and private sectors are absolutely key in achieving that.
Thank you, Mark. Do we have any questions from the audience? Yeah. Gavin or Simon? We have some, yeah.
Hey everyone, thank you. I'm Miles, I'm a scientist from AstraZeneca. And you spoke a lot in both of the talks about commitments that various countries have made to achieving carbon neutrality by 2050, for example, and lots of organizations have similar commitments. My own company committed to being carbon neutral by 2030. What happens if we don't achieve these goals? And sort of relating back to the theme of this conference, should governments do more to penalize countries and organizations if they don't meet those goals that they've set themselves?
Gideon or Brian, would either of you like to take that question?
So I can give you a beginning of an answer, but I'm sure others will have things to say as well. And the UK is not alone in having set legal obligations for itself to meet net zero. So it's now possible for the government to be legally challenged by its failure to meet these targets that it's set. The challenges of individual countries, individual companies, I suppose, is the current idea is that the pressure comes from the people buying the goods and services from those companies. And many times those companies have made the commitment because they believe they need a social license to operate. And if people start withdrawing their custom because they believe the company's not taking climate change seriously, that's quite effective. I think in the longer term, what we may well see is that as some nations and some multinationals move more successfully than others, we may start to see border taxes being used to directly penalise countries or bodies that don't meet climate goals. But I think that's still some way off. And at the moment, it's really, as the point Brian made, that this is largely about motivating voluntary activity, real activity. So it's not just about, yeah, we're going to put out a banner saying we're going to meet net zero, but what are we actually going to do to meet it? It's that voluntary buy-in which is important, and then to make sure it's actioned.
Absolutely.
Yeah, of course.
Can I just
Brian.
follow up on that? Well, the first thing that will happen if we don't meet those net zero targets is that climate will keep changing. But actually, I think the optimistic view that I have there is, what are the technologies of the future? And what would the UK, for instance, have in its industry in the future? It's these new technologies where the growth will be. And the companies and the countries that actually develop those will be in charge of the new industries, the new wealth of the world. So, I mean, I think there's going to be a big move, positive move, when people see that this is working, this is actually where the jobs are. That's going to actually lead to a cascade effect that we don't need a big policeman. We'll actually have the others will be encouraged to come along. That's my optimistic view.
And Brian, just to further expand on that, do you think there are the programs in place already to enable it, or do you think also there needs to be more done to provide the money for that earlier technologies to be investigated?
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
I mean, the role of government here to me is to set the tilt in the playing field so that then everyone can come along, play the game, but the incentive is there to do the way that we want this thing to go. There's a lot of, at Imperial, we see all these startups which are coming in the new technology areas, and they're all full of ideas, and the initial development of there, and some of them are managing to get through beyond that, but it is this help for those new technologies to really get going, and the enthusiasm. A lot of the investment money now is actually, the smart money is going in these directions, but there's still a lot of legacy of the fossil fuel era and a lot of money associated with that. And so we've got to just encourage the new technologies to break through, and that encouragement is needed.
Can I come in on the same point? Because I showed one number from a government point of view in my talk, which is the 75 million that DEFRA have committed to its research and innovation in this space, some of which will be delivered in that sort of innovation focused way to try and generate the industries of the future. There are substantial other spending from UK government. There is so on the greenhouse gas removal that both Brian and I mentioned, there is about 30 million being spent through UKRI and about another 70 million particularly looking at how we can draw do direct air capture from bays. Those are just UK examples, but there are much bigger programs in the US which are pushing in the same. What are the solutions? Where's the innovation that's going to give us the solution and the industry of the future? And the estimate for the value of low carbon tech globally is about $1 trillion a year. So the market is already huge and it's just going to get bigger. So I very strongly agree with Brian, but I think there is a lot of government effort there as well as private sector effort to be those futures.
Could I just come in as well on that one? Just from a business point of view, I think it's slightly different given government decisions and the shorter term timescales we talked about, but I'm quite hopeful that in private business, the financial markets and the financial sector are actually seeing it more as we have to do this, and that's being now priced into businesses. So I think that is going to be a key driver to be taking forward business change.
I think you can see that as well, Lizzie, in terms of the popular, the green funds now, fund managers, the demand from the people involved in that, what the customers wanting that to be very upfront, and that's only going to expand more and more. And Simon, we have a question here in the front. Yes, thank you.
Can I just say one final point on that?
Of course.
Round off the panel, and that existing question will be line this one up. I think the question around policing of commitments and things, in that space, working as a scientist within government, my role, a large element of it is working with policymakers to facilitate evidence-led policy development. And at its most basic level, policies are the things you do to affect change in the world. And I think there can be perhaps a public perception sometimes that the jump to do that is to police and have a heavy hand. But I think in all policy development, there's a really important role here for the carrot and the stick, and the carrot is where we start. I think for all of us here in this room, there's a really, really important role for us in the scientific space to ensure that the evidence persists and is made available to inform that. Because a lot of people want to do the right thing, and it is our job and our challenge to enable them to do that.
Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. So my name's Amy Booth. I'm also based at the University of Oxford doing research on NHS and net zero. So I just wanted to thank you both for some really great talks, looking at both the UK and the global perspective. You sort of alluded to it, Gideon, but I was wondering whether you could comment more on the legal action that was taken against the UK government in terms of its net zero plans by Client Earth and other organizations, and specifically how those policies are now being adapted to reach the legal requirements that the UK has committed to, and perhaps also just commenting on how the UK is planning on, and if it's planning on, reducing some of its historic emissions. Thank you.
I think I'll start off by saying how effective a tool that's been. I think that we shouldn't underestimate the power of the public. I mean, we live in a democracy, and democracies in Europe where what the public say makes a big difference to the actions that governments take. So the activities of groups as radical as Extinction Rebellion, or some of those which are targeted more on legal action, are helping to make the transition happen and pushing it that way. And we see that being effective in all sorts of areas. I think air quality is another example where it's being very effective. So I think the legal basis of the challenge that was made against the net zero strategy, my personal reflection on that is that it's a shame, because I'm partly going to respond to Brian's accusation at the beginning of his talk now as well, in that the UK, of course, could have gone further since we first recognised the impacts of climate change, but we have taken a leadership position internationally, and I think it is really important to recognise that. And I don't have a party political view here, and regardless of what your party political view is, I think Margaret Thatcher was the first person to speak internationally powerfully about the importance of climate change. The the Climate Change Act was brought into power under Blair, and possibly the most important piece of climate legislation in the world ever. And then the Net Zero Act was signed into law by Theresa May's government. And it's been without any discussion in Parliament because it was so broadly agreed. So the UK has been leading in this area for some time, and I think we need to recognise that. The Net Zero strategy that I showed the cover of is a globally leading document. And the fact that it doesn't lay out all of the ways that we're going to solve the challenge of meeting Carbon Budget 6, I don't think is as bad as it has been made out, because there is a serious effort to work out how to do it. And the 75 million that we're spending in DEFRA to try and solve those problems is part of that. These are difficult problems. And the examples that Brian raised of, okay, we just need to insulate our homes. It is cripplingly expensive if we insulate all our homes, and we can't afford it. And even if we did afford it, where are all the people going to come from to do all the insulation? There aren't enough workforce to do it. So clearly we should do it, but it's not easy to do it, and we have to work out how to do it. That's a long and perhaps slightly rambling answer, but I think it's important to be positive, work out these are difficult challenges, and to innovate and try and bring novel solutions to help to solve them.
Thank you. Brian, would you like to make any comment?
I totally agree that the UK has been a leader in this area. It's in danger of losing its leading role. That's what I was trying to say. And I think the handover to COP27 is an example of that.
I think we had we have two questions here at the back, Simon. And then we'll take we have one online as well after.
Thank you. Thank you for some great presentations. Catherine Welsh, I'm from UCL Public Policy. I think we would probably all agree that the science on climate change is clear, and yet as a global society, we're still not taking the actions needed. So my question is, as scientists, what more can we or should we be doing, if anything, to bring policy, industry and the public along the journey with us? Thank you.
Thank you. Brian, would you like to start?
Yeah, I mean, I've been trying for the last 45 years. So yeah, and we have to raise our voice, and we have to take people with us. And doing this sort of event, giving that talk back in 1975, talking to politicians, but in general, as Gideon has said, if the people want it, I think it will happen. And the people have to show they want it enough, that it is up there on priority. It's all too easy for the problems of this week or this winter to actually deflect from what is the crucial goal. And for me, every policy in government should be looked at through the glasses of climate change. What is going to be the impact on that? So, but that's only going to happen if people say that this is so important. So I always say to people, they say, well, what can we do? The first thing is raise your voice. In a democracy, you have the ability to do that, and do raise it.
Can I come in on that as well? I think that I agree completely, and it's important to keep raising our voice as scientists and as the public. It's not sufficient, though. I think we know it's bad, and the fact that the Paris Agreement happened, there was an international agreement that this is a serious issue. It's going to be really bad if we don't fix it. Is known and believed widely. We need to be in the solution space now. We need to work out what are the ways we can solve this. How can we decarbonize our sections, our sectors? How can we do that in an efficient way? How can we do it in a cost-effective way? How can we bring people with us as we do that? And I think there is a real mindset change that we need in climate science now, away from continually pointing out how bad it's going to get if we don't act, to now working out how we should act specifically at national, at local level in individual sectors to solve the problem.
Can I pick up on we have to say how bad it might be in order to see what the adaptation problem is. But if I can give an example of using one's voice elsewhere too, I chair the science review panel for a UK-China climate science for services. And the other day, the discussion was the time in China that on the high scenarios, the temperature will be above that wet bulb temperature greater than 35. So it's a warning, but it's actually a warning to an international area. We can't do this without China and India, and actually making sure that we do collaborate on seeing just how bad that will be as a scientist is actually incredibly important to get that through to governments around the world. I mean, I think Russia tended to think, oh, this is no problem, until a few years ago, it was so hot with the fires around Moscow and whatever, and the permafrost melting. I think, again, bringing home the problem around the world to those who think, you know, this is going to be all right. It's not going to be all right for anyone.
Could I just come in as well on that?
Of course.
I agree with Brian. I think raising up the agenda and having that impetus on it is what's needed. And something that gave me great hope was the way science and technology and as a social problem was treated with the COVID pandemic and the global fraternity that sort of came together around that. And I just kind of wanted to put my own question to Brian and Gideon really is, do you think that there is a way that that sort of impetus can be gathered around climate change, which obviously is a potential driver for pandemics, but everything else that goes with it? Or do you think it's something more inherent that it's such a big problem to grasp that we kind of can't hold that as something like a pandemic, as something to focus on?
It's happening more slowly, isn't it? And that's the challenge. That's what enabled us to transform the way we brought science to bear to a problem during the pandemic, was that it was here now, right now. We've got to deal with it right now. And I think the big challenge with climate is to get the sense of urgency to channel that science and innovation into it. But I do believe that is growing, and you see it in, and I don't want to be seen as a defender of the government. I'm certainly allowed to say things that are negative about the government if I want to. But you see it by the fact that we have a legal requirement to meet net zero, and all the departments in government are thinking hard, talking to their sectors about how we bring science to bear to that challenge. So I think there is a push in that direction. I just wish it would go faster.
Yeah, I mean, internationally, I think it's incredibly important to interact with the various countries around the world. Renewable energy is such an obvious thing for most developing countries in the tropics in particular. You know, it's such a natural solution. And if we can help in that solution, I think already China is actually a leader of most of the technologies that we tend to be using. And I say to people, the thing you should be worrying about is China is in charge of those technologies. And that's the big concern for us. But India, I think, is getting aware now of the problem, and the fact it's coal that it was going to rely on is not the solution, as climate change in terms of temperature, in terms of water availability, the water table in the Ganges plain is dropping, the rivers from the Tibetan plateau are less reliable, the heat that comes, the monsoon rains, they are realizing there's a problem, and it's incredibly important to interact with them as they realize that this isn't just a problem they can cope with, that at some point, and that's my human thresholds, it's a long-term problem, but at some point, for some person in some region, it becomes unlivable and they suddenly take action. So what we've got to try and do is get countries aware of these problems before they reach that point rather than after.
So from my perspective, I've worked inside government for a number of years now in a variety of roles. Actually, my first civil service job was just across the river in Custom House. My perspective is, in government, there will always be more policies than time to do them in a given time. And a lot of that just comes down to simple practical considerations like getting bills through Parliament. It takes time. There is a bandwidth capability within that. And to go back to the origin of this question here, what can we do? I think, to hark back to this morning's session, I don't think we can oversell the importance of storytelling, because in a political sphere, in a science sphere, things happen that people care about, and particularly if the public very visibly cares about something because they understand it, in the run-up to an election cycle, that means a manifesto commitment, that means a change that is impacted in the real world. So I think we all have a role in that space.
Thanks, Mark. Simon, I think there was another question down here near that previous question. Yep, thank you.
Can everybody hear me? All right, I'm Hadiza, so I manage research at the University of Bristol in nuclear and digital, and I have two questions. Firstly, you identified that engaging with emerging economies is really key if we're serious about tackling carbon emissions, especially looking into the future. What can be done on a governmental and policy level to actually provide opportunities and funding for innovators, researchers, and people that really drive change to work with the international community and to work on this global scale? Because this is something that we've encountered at the university sometimes, whereby researchers want to work with international teams and international bodies and international companies to tackle these problems globally, and they're unable to because there isn't necessarily an avenue to do so. And my second question, a couple of the presentations raised the topic of food, and I think that this is really interesting because it kind of can parallel through other industries too, whereby we know the problem. We spend a lot of time understanding the problem. We actually have solutions. Scientists have worked really hard to make so many amazing solutions that can provide alternatives and change the way we eat forever. But what's missing? What's the missing piece of the puzzle that means that we haven't got to where we need to be, where the change is actually implemented on a wide scale, that we actually see an impact in the emissions that we produce as a country? Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, I think Gideon, as you said, we like our dairy and our meat. So is there anything you'd like to?
Yeah, well, shall I start on food?
Yeah.
I mean, we have got some solutions. Agriculture is a phenomenally difficult sector to decarbonize. I believe it's not true to say that we've got solutions for all of agricultural emissions. Agricultural emissions globally is nearly a third of our emissions, something between a quarter and a third of our emissions. And there are some parts of the world where if they don't eat meat, they won't eat anything and they won't get any protein and they will starve. So in some sectors, an agricultural system which is built around an emitting way of growing food is built into the way that the society survives. So although we may be able to reduce our emissions in the UK, if we can persuade the public and the farming system away from that, there are other systems that are even harder to decarbonize in agriculture. And that's an example. I mean, food is, it's easy to forget that we absolutely have to have it. You've got to eat. And at the moment, we can't make it without emitting greenhouse gases. So I think that's an example of the sort of solution space that we need to continue to be in. How do we change the science, but also the behavior, the culture, the economics of the system to continually chip away and decrease the emissions? I'll just very quickly answer your other question, if I may, or try and be quick anyway. I think the international component is really important. At Glasgow, which I agree with Brian, it wasn't as successful as we might have hoped, but nor was it a complete failure. One of the interesting areas, I think, was the Glasgow breakthrough goals, where there were 5 particular targets that were set there, in which many countries signed up to, which were an effort to really use a bit more open innovation, where ideas are shared across the world about how we can solve things together, and giving technologies and ideas to other countries, sometimes done through scientific exchange, but also sometimes through funded exchange, particularly using some of the international climate finance or other mechanisms. So we could talk longer about this, but there are a number of ways in which the international effort to share solutions is really important and quite lively.
Thank
If I
you.
could give a personal example of existing government activity in that space. So immediately prior to my current role, I worked as a livestock science specialist in DEFRA on ways to increase the productivity, sustainability and resilience of livestock farming in the UK. And a big part of that role was working internationally to pool funds to achieve bigger, better, bolder research that involved a very great diverse array of countries from around the world to solve these common problems together. So we're not starting from a position of zero by any means. There is a tremendous amount of perhaps not publicly well communicated activity in this space. And the UK is very active in it and one of the most influential players.
Thanks, Mark. We're going to just move on to a question as well from online. So this is from an anonymous, but we've touched on dual crisis with biodiversity, and there's also rising concern regarding exceeding the planetary boundary for contaminants and chemical pollution. Given that recognition of this issue is currently much lower than climate change, there's large knowledge gaps and there's a need to make policy decisions under this uncertainty. Are there lessons that can be learned from the climate change community on how to present and communicate the issues?
As I said, I think we must have done a very bad job because we've been trying for a long time. I would hope that there are, in terms of assessing the science, as getting the countries of the world, scientists from around the world, assessing the problem and presenting it to governments together for discussion. So the whole IPCC, UNFCCC, it's taken a very long time in the climate area, but perhaps it's there in the biodiversity area now. COP15 is coming up in the biodiversity area soon. And maybe we can try and get these discussions happening quicker in other areas. But there is a move to try and get the climate change and biodiversity ones much more locked together, and that would be helpful. But the danger is it may slow down the climate change ones where we know what to do. It's just a question of the will to do it. With biodiversity, we may be a little behind on that. And with other areas on the chemicals, you're a little behind that. So in some ways, we want to tackle the problems that we know what to do, but we don't want to do anything that would make the others more difficult. And if we can draw them together, that would certainly be good.
I think there's two lessons that we can learn from climate, which I have seen more, but DEFRA is responsible for biodiversity and pollution, actually. So I think that one of the lessons is the need to continue to communicate sometimes difficult things. And an example in the climate area is people's instinctive feeling a couple of decades ago that climate and weather were kind of the same. And that why should I care about 1 degree warming? Brian made this point when every day I step out and it's a different temperature than it was the day before. Why does climate matter? And being willing to continue to communicate, no, climate is different from weather and climate matters and here's why, and be clear about that, that is important. I don't think we're quite done that with biodiversity yet. We've started to almost relabel it as nature and sort of give it a different set of descriptors. That there is something that's intrinsically important about biodiversity, and as scientists, we've got to keep talking about that and communicating why it matters that we live on a biodiverse planet. So that's one question. The other issue that's really important, I think, to learn from climate is it starts to matter when it matters to individuals and individual people. And we've seen that, again, Brian's used examples of fires around Moscow, but there's countless examples that we've all got of floods, droughts, fires, etc., heat waves, where individuals have been impacted and they start to really care and believe in it. And I think we need to do the same thing with biodiversity and with pollution. Bring it home to people. This is why it matters to you and your family and your livelihood if we're going to land it. And I would just close by saying I'm really glad that the questioner asked about pollution as well. We often think about climate and biodiversity together. I think we need to think about all three of them together. And it's good that I think that UNEA, so the UN environmental body, is currently scoping whether it's sensible to have an equivalent to the COP meetings and the UNFCCC Convention for Biodiversity process, but for pollution. So I think that's an important possible step.
Can I just add the big advantage for the climate problem is that we have a metric that everyone will agree on, which is global temperature. Globally average temperature. I said it doesn't mean anything to an individual, but it's very useful for the discussions to actually discuss what that temperature might be. There's a target. In biodiversity, it is very difficult to get any target that everyone will agree on, and probably on the air quality as well.
Jace, if I could make a point, so I suppose a kind of a plug and an offer. The team outputs of me and my team and our work was designed 4 years ago, 3-4 years ago, to present a high level understanding of what's happening in the environment, and chemicals are part of that and understanding it. And we are starting to understand about new emerging classes of chemicals, so things like PFAS, which we suspect there may be perhaps more we need to better understand there about impact on the environment. So in the outcome indicator framework, when it was launched, was, I suppose, an abandonment of hubris, and there was a recognition that this will not last in aspect forever perfect as the be all and end all of what we need to know to understand how the environment is changing. So there's a baked in commitment to review the entire framework every 5 years, to take a step back and think, does this give us the information we need to understand? So go engage with our research. We will be reviewing it in 2024. If you genuinely feel in your field of research this is a major piece of environmental concern that is not being adequately deliberated, tell us. We have a feedback form, we have an email address. Give us that information, and I can guarantee you when it comes to that review of the framework, I will be having that discussion with policymakers to understand, is this something we need to consider more activity in the space?
Thanks, Mark. So I'd like to just offer, if anyone would like to make any closing remarks. I feel like Gideon and Brian, you've made some nice remarks there at the end, but the offer is there if you'd like to make any further closing remarks.
Perhaps I could just link with the interdisciplinary discussion in the previous session, because the essence of dealing with this problem, we need expertise, but we need people who are able to talk to others in different expertise as well. So it's crucial to what we're trying to do at Imperial, at the Grantham Institute, actually train people who are experts in some area that's needed in climate change, but able to speak to others who are experts in the other areas. And it's very important that we are able to do this. The climate change issue is involved with our whole way of life, and we need to embrace our whole way of life in order to tackle the issue.
Thank you.
So got a plug for Grantham there as well as a plug for DEFRA. I don't need to re-plug DEFRA, it's already been plugged. So I'll just close by thanking people for a great set of questions and your attention, but also to reiterate the point that I've made, I think, a couple of times, that we need to not stop talking about how bad climate is, but go beyond that and talk about what are the solutions. And that is a set of problems that we face across all societies, all sectors and all nations. And we all need to be innovating in that space. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. I feel this could have gone on for another this stimulating discussion, but I'd like to thank you all for being here in person and online. And thank you to Brian and Gideon, and also our panel members, Lizzie and Mark. So if you join me on a round of applause for the panelists.